1945, a year suspended between the fadings of a brutal world war and the first fragile breaths of peace. Europe lay wounded, its cities scarred, its people hollowed, its armies exhausted. And across this broken landscape, countless prisoners of war waited in camps far from home, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. For many, the war had ended, but the fear had not. Among them were German female prisoners, captured in the final months of the conflict. They had marched through ruined villages, boarded overcrowded trucks, and endured sleepless nights beneath foreign skies. Every step carried the weight of uncertainty. Would they face vengeance? Would they be starved, mistreated, forgotten? No one could promise anything, and rumors, dark, unkind rumors, traveled faster than hope. But on one quiet evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and painted the sky in hues of deep amber and fading gold, everything changed. The women were escorted into a large wooden hall, its architecture simple, its atmosphere strangely warm. They expected an interrogation, perhaps a briefing, perhaps punishment. But what awaited them inside was something none of them could have imagined in their most desperate moments. Before them stretched a long dining table, covered end to end with food, real food, not rations, not scraps, not dry bread, but steaming dishes, fresh vegetables, warm broth, roasted meats, fruit in bowls overflowing with color. It was a sight so impossible, so wildly out of place in the ravaged world outside, that the women could only stop and stare. In that moment, the horrors of war fell silent, replaced by a single overwhelming truth: kindness could still exist, even here. Even now. The women stepped into the hall slowly, their movements stiff and uncertain, as though each footstep might trigger something unseen. After months of captivity, suspicion had become a form of survival, a shield they carried everywhere, and it pressed heavily against their ribs now as they crossed the threshold. The wooden floor beneath them creaked softly, a gentle and almost domestic sound that felt strangely out of place in their world of barbed wire, barking orders, and cold earth. The hall stretched wider than they expected, its walls built of polished timber that gleamed under the warm glow of lanterns. Light flickered across their gaunt faces, revealing hollow cheeks, weary eyes, and uniforms that had long since surrendered to dirt and exhaustion. Yet it wasn't the room itself that froze them in place. It was the sight waiting directly at its center. A long dining table, so large it seemed to swallow the hall, stood adorned with dishes that looked like something from another lifetime. The tablecloth was clean, white, pressed, completely free of stains, and the edges fell neatly over the sides like a curtain opening to reveal a show they were not prepared for. At first, the women wondered if they were imagining it. Their eyes widened, then narrowed, then blinked hard, as though trying to clear a fog from their vision. Hunger had played tricks on their minds before. They had dreamed of bread and woken to rations so small they could vanish in a single bite. They had smelled phantom soup simmering over the fires of their memory. But this was tangible, real, present. Steam curled gently from bowls filled with thick, hearty soup, vegetables floating in golden broth, herbs sprinkled on top as if someone had cared enough to add beauty to nourishment. There were plates of roasted vegetables, glistening with oil, trays of bread stacked high, their crusts warm and slightly cracked from the oven. And scattered among these were dishes of beans, rice, fruits, spreads, and small pots of butter. Real butter, something many had not tasted in more than a year. The colors of the food, deep browns, bright greens, soft yellows, felt like an assault on senses dulled by scarcity. They had become accustomed to monotony, to beige meals that barely qualified as meals. This table, by contrast, was a riot of color and warmth that seemed impossible in a world still trembling from war. The women exchanged glances, quick sharp looks filled with unspoken questions. Why was this here? For whom was it prepared? Surely not for them. They were prisoners, defeated soldiers, reminders of a nation that had tried, and failed, to impose its will on the world. They had not been treated cruelly, but they had not been treated kindly either. They knew the Americans were strict, structured, and careful. They provided what was necessary, rarely more. But this feast was not necessary. This was something else entirely. Something they could not name yet. No one moved. Even those standing closer to the table took a cautious step back, as if afraid the moment would collapse if they approached too boldly. The air around them felt thick, and for a brief second, none of them breathed. The only sounds were the soft crackle of lantern flames and the faint rustle of uniforms as someone shifted in place. Their escorts, American guards, stood behind them, silent, composed. They did not bark orders or gesture sharply. Instead, they held themselves with calm patience, as though waiting for the women to overcome their disbelief. One guard finally lifted a hand. Not aggressively, not with authority, but with an open palm facing the table, inviting rather than commanding. The gesture itself felt surprising. Invitations had become a foreign concept. The women glanced at him, then back at the table, then at one another. A few whispered under their breath, their voices barely audible, carrying the tremble of fear and confusion. "Is this for us?" one asked. Another shook her head. "It can't be." A third swallowed visibly, staring at the bread as though it might vanish if she blinked. Still, none of them stepped forward. They had grown used to caution. In the camps they had passed through, unpredictability was often wrapped in harshness. A sudden gathering could mean a roll call, a reprimand, or another grueling task. Generosity was not something they expected. Not anymore, not after the collapse of everything they once believed protected them. The guards exchanged glances among themselves, understanding the hesitation. One of them spoke, not loudly, not sternly, but in a tone that softened the edges of the room. "It's for you," he said simply. His voice carried a warmth that the women had not heard from a uniformed man in years. His words settled over them like a blanket woven from disbelief and hesitant hope. Still, the women hesitated. Their stomachs tightened, part hunger, part fear, part memory. Some of them hadn't eaten a full meal in days. Some were too ashamed to even sit at a table they felt unworthy of. Their lives had been reduced to routines of survival, not comfort, and the idea of accepting kindness felt foreign. A few of them instinctively touched their sleeves, where the letters, POW, were marked clearly. The fabric reminded them of who they were now. Not soldiers, not daughters, not wives, just prisoners. Yet the table in front of them contradicted that identity. It told a different story. One where they were allowed, even encouraged to sit, rest, and eat. It was not a trap, but their instincts struggled to accept that. Finally, one of the older women in the group inhaled deeply, drawing strength from some hidden reserve. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes held a spark of curiosity. She took a step forward, not bold, but deliberate. And the floor creaked beneath her boot. All eyes followed her. The guards did not intervene. She reached the table and stopped, looking down at the food as though trying to understand it. Slowly, almost reverently, she extended her hand and hovered it above a loaf of bread. She did not touch it. She merely held her palm above it to feel its warmth. It was warm. Her breath escaped as a quiet gasp, as if warmth alone was a luxury she had forgotten. Her reaction broke something inside the others. Not in a painful way, but in a way that released a long-held tension. One by one they stepped forward. Cautiously, timidly, like people approaching a fragile miracle. Their steps remained slow, the disbelief still heavy, but movement had begun, and it spread through them like a ripple through still water. When they reached the table, they didn't sit immediately. Instead, they stared, at the dishes, at the utensils laid neatly beside each plate, at the folded napkins that seemed crafted with care. Everything felt intentional. Everything felt human. And that, perhaps, was the most overwhelming part. Humanity. They had been without it for so long that its return felt almost frightening. The guards gestured for them to sit, and after several heartbeats of hesitation, the women obeyed. They lowered themselves onto the wooden chairs, their bodies stiff with uncertainty. Some clutched the edges of their seats, as though grounding themselves in reality. Others simply stared at the table, their eyes glassy with emotion. Not a single one lifted a utensil. Not yet. Their hands remained still, resting on their laps or gripping the edge of the table as they waited for something. An order, a permission, an explanation. But none came. Only silence and warmth filled the hall, creating a strange sense of peace that was both comforting and unbearable. One woman whispered, voice trembling. Why would they do this? Another answered, her tone barely more than breath, maybe the war really is ending. But even that seemed too hopeful to accept. A deep quiet settled over the hall, the kind of quiet that transforms uncertainty into anticipation. The women remained frozen between fear and awe, unable to move yet unable to look away. Everything they saw contradicted the world they had lived in for so long. They were prisoners, and yet, they were being shown generosity. Real generosity. The kind that warms a room without fire. The kind that softens hearts still bruised by war. For the first time in a very long time, the world felt unfamiliar in a way that wasn't terrifying, but humbling. As the women slowly took their places at the long wooden table, an almost sacred silence settled over the hall. The chairs beneath them felt sturdier than anything they had sat on in months, their smooth surfaces contrasting sharply with the rough ground, unstable benches, or cold metal frames they had become accustomed to in captivity. The moment their bodies relaxed into the seats, they felt the unfamiliar sensation of comfort. Small, fragile, tentative, yet undeniably present. But the true force pulling their attention was the food. It lay before them like a collection of rare treasures, each dish radiating warmth and abundance in a world that had offered them so little of either. The aromas drifted upward in soft curls, weaving through the air like a gentle invitation. The scent of freshly baked bread was the first to reach them. A warm, soft fragrance that carried memories of childhood kitchens, quiet evenings at home, and families they hadn't seen in years. For some of the women, the smell alone was enough to make their eyes burn with emotion. Bread had become a symbol of survival during the war, something rationed, fought over, treasured. And here it was in abundance, loaves stacked high, each one whole, unbroken, untouched. Beside the bread sat bowls of steaming soup so rich and thick that even from their seats the women could see vegetables floating generously within it. Carrots, potatoes, beans. Ingredients that had vanished from their lives long before the war ended. The broth shimmered under the lantern light, golden and hearty, as though promising warmth that reached deeper than the stomach. The soup looked like something from the kind of home-cooked meal they used to imagine during sleepless nights in the cold. They had whispered dreams of such food in the dark, only to wake and find themselves surrounded by hunger instead. The meats placed along the table drew their gaze next. Roasted cuts lay neatly arranged on platters, their surfaces glistening with seasoning, and juices that caught the light with an almost taunting beauty. A few of the women swallowed instinctively at the sight, as though their bodies reacted before their minds could accept what they were seeing. Meat had become luxury, rare, distant, nearly forgotten. Some of the prisoners had not tasted a proper piece of it since the early years of the war. To see it here, prepared with care, felt almost unreal. There were vegetables too, bright vivid vegetables arranged with intention. Corn shining like tiny pieces of gold. Beans in rich shades of green. Sliced beets glowing deep purple. The colors were vibrant, almost too vibrant, like paintings come to life. After so many months of monotony, of gray food and gray days, these colors felt overwhelming, like stepping into sunlight after weeks in darkness. Fruits were scattered in bowls, apples, pears, grapes, polished until they shone. One woman stared at a cluster of grapes for nearly a full minute, as though she had forgotten what such fruit felt like between her teeth, as though she feared touching it might break the spell of this strange miracle. Utensils were arranged neatly beside each plate, their surfaces gleaming. The spoons, forks, and knives were clean, so clean they reflected the lantern light like tiny mirrors. The prisoners could see their own tired eyes, their own hollow cheeks, reflected faintly in the metal. Many of them hesitated to touch the utensils at all, unsure if they were truly meant to use them. They were used to collecting meager rations in tin cups or dented bowls, often having to choose between eating quickly before the food cooled or saving it in small bites to stretch the comfort a little longer. Now, everything about this table suggested time to eat slowly, time to taste, time to simply exist without fear. Yet not a single woman reached out. Their hands remained still, fingers curled tightly in their laps, knuckles pale and tense. Their bodies were hungry, achingly hungry, but their minds could not catch up to the reality in front of them. Years of conditioning, months of scarcity, and days of uncertainty had taught them that nothing abundant came without cost. The more generous something looked, the more dangerous they feared it could be. A few exchanged glances across the table, silent conversations spoken through widened eyes and furrowed brows. Some looked toward the guards standing along the walls, searching for hidden meaning. But the guards watched calmly, neither impatient nor stern. Their posture lacked the rigid authority the women had come to expect from men in uniform. Instead, they seemed to stand in quiet respect for the moment unfolding before them. One guard finally stepped forward, not abruptly, but with the steady grace of someone who understood the weight of what the women were experiencing. He nodded gently, encouraging them to begin. His voice was calm, reassuring. "Go ahead," he said. "It's yours." But even those simple words, kind, clear, unmistakable, were not enough to break through the barricades built by fear. One of the women closest to the soup pot reached out slowly, her hand trembling so visibly that the guards noticed. Her fingers hovered above the ladle, hesitating as though waiting for someone to snatch the opportunity away. She darted a quick look left, then right, checking to see if anyone would protest her movement. But no one did. The guards remained still. The other women watched, holding their breath. She wrapped her fingers around the ladle. The metal felt warm, comforting, familiar in a way she hadn't expected. She lifted it, her wrist shaking under the weight. Not because the ladle was heavy, but because the moment itself was overwhelming. As she poured the soup into her bowl, the sound, the gentle splash of broth, echoed far louder in her mind than in the hall. It was the sound of something she thought she had lost forever: sustenance, safety, mercy. One by one, the other women followed her example. Still cautiously, still with hesitation, but now with the faintest thread of courage weaving through their actions. They ladled soup into bowls. They reached for bread. One woman tore a piece off so gently it was as if she feared the loaf might shatter like glass. Another touched a roasted carrot, as though checking to ensure it wasn't merely painted wood. Their hands trembled, not from cold, but from disbelief. A few lifted spoons but paused before taking their first bite. One woman shut her eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the aroma fill her senses. In that moment, memories rushed through her. Her mother's kitchen, rain tapping the window, the comfort of a warm meal after a long day. The memory was so vivid that tears welled in her eyes and she lowered her spoon, covering her mouth to stifle a sob. She wasn't alone. Across the table, another woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the sudden emotion. A third clenched her jaw tightly, refusing to let tears fall, but her trembling gave her away. This meal was more than food. It was a reminder of humanity in a world that had stripped it away. It was a message, unspoken, yet powerful: you may be prisoners, but you are still human. As the first woman finally took a sip of soup, her lips parted in shock. She had forgotten what warmth tasted like. Forgotten what real vegetables felt like in her mouth. Forgotten how food could comfort the soul, not just the body. She lifted the spoon again, faster this time, hungrier, letting the flavors wash over her. Others followed, their movements growing steadier with each bite. Gradually, the hall filled with soft sounds: spoons clinking against bowls, quiet breaths of relief, and occasional choked attempts to hold back tears. Some women ate slowly, savoring every mouthful as though afraid it would be their last. Others ate with urgency, as though making up for months of deprivation. But all of them felt something shift inside them. Something deep, something fragile, something hopeful. This feast was not luxury. It was dignity, returned to them in the simplest, most profound way possible. With every bite the women took, something intangible but unmistakable began to soften inside them. It wasn't simply hunger being satisfied or bodies being nourished. It was the slow unraveling of tension woven into their bones by months of fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion. The first sips of soup had been cautious, almost timid, but as warmth spread from their throats to their chests, the stiffness in their shoulders began to loosen. The tightness around their eyes eased. Their breathing deepened. They were still prisoners. Nothing about that had changed. But the atmosphere around them felt less like captivity, and more like a moment carved out of time, suspended between the past they had endured, and the future they could not yet imagine. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the women tasted something other than their own fear. The richness of the meal seeped through their bodies like medicine. They could feel warm broth settling into empty stomachs that had learned to expect only dryness. The soft texture of the bread reminded them that tenderness still existed somewhere in the world. And with each slow, deliberate bite, the invisible chains wrapped around their hearts loosened by another fraction. Many of them had not shared a real meal with others, since their battalions scattered across battlefields and forests. Eating had become a task, a survival ritual stripped of pleasure. Now, sitting at this long table surrounded by faces etched with fatigue, they experienced something that felt dangerously close to peace. They weren't laughing. They weren't smiling. But there was something gentle in the air, something that allowed them to lower their guard, in ways they never would have believed possible hours earlier. As the women ate, the guards moved quietly around the hall. Their boots made soft sounds against the wooden floor, the kind of rhythmic, steady footsteps that held no threat. They carried pitchers of water, clean, cool, clear water, and walked from person to person, refilling cups that had barely been touched. Each motion was deliberate and unhurried, as though the guards understood that even a rushed gesture might shatter the fragile calm beginning to settle over the table. One guard leaned slightly toward a woman whose hands still trembled around her cup. "Here," he said gently, pouring water for her. She stiffened at his closeness, instinctively bracing herself. But the guard stepped back immediately, offering nothing except a respectful nod. The woman blinked, stunned. She had expected force, command, or the cold indifference she had experienced during transport. Instead, she had been met with courtesy, simple, human courtesy. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. Across the table, two younger women exchanged glances. They too seemed baffled by the sight of guards who offered rather than ordered. These were men in uniform. American uniforms. The uniforms they had been taught to fear. The uniforms they had once fought against in burning towns and dense forests. Yet here those same uniforms were serving them food, checking if they were comfortable, speaking softly as though the women were guests rather than captives. One of the prisoners lowered her spoon and looked at her hands. Thin, dirt-stained, shaking. She whispered something under her breath, a question meant only for herself. Why? She wasn't asking about the food. She was asking about the gesture. About the meaning. About the quiet kindness that felt so foreign it bordered on frightening. She knew war. She knew hostility. She knew bitterness, loss, and survival. But mercy like this, unexpected, unfamiliar, unthinkable. And yet here it was. As more of the women finished their initial servings, they sat quietly, unsure if they were allowed to take seconds. The guards noticed the hesitation long before anyone spoke. One of them stepped forward, nodding at the bowls. "If you want more, take more," he said softly. His tone carried no pressure, only reassurance. A few women blinked, uncertain whether they had heard him correctly. Seconds. The word didn't fit into their world anymore. Abundance was a concept reserved for memories, not reality. Still, slowly, hesitantly, a handful reached again for the ladles. Their movements were cautious, almost apologetic, as though they feared being punished for taking too much. But no reprimand came. No harsh voice cut through the quiet. Instead, the guards simply watched with calm, open expressions. One woman, who had been silent since entering the hall, suddenly let out a breath that shuddered through her frame. She wasn't crying, but the sound was dangerously close. Her expression softened, not with joy, not with relief, but with a kind of fragile bewilderment. She whispered, "If only my brother could see this, he wouldn't believe it." The woman beside her placed a gentle hand on her wrist. Not to comfort with words, but simply to anchor her in the moment. They shared a quiet understanding. This experience felt like a miracle they weren't sure they had earned. The hall filled with the soft sounds of utensils moving against plates, water being poured, quiet breaths breaking through long-held silence. No one raised their voice. No one barked an order. For a moment, it was as though the war outside the walls had simply vanished, leaving behind a lull of peace so delicate it felt like an illusion. The guards stood near the walls now, giving the women space. Their presence no longer felt threatening, it simply felt steady. The women observed them as they ate, their discipline, their calm expressions, their respectful distance. These were soldiers too, men who had seen cruelty, loss, and destruction. And yet they chose this moment to offer kindness. It was this realization, more than the food, more than the water, that struck the women the hardest. Kindness in war felt unnatural. Kindness from an enemy felt impossible. And kindness toward prisoners felt miraculous. The women did not speak much, but their silence was no longer shaped by fear. It was shaped by reflection. Each one felt something shifting inside her, something she could not yet name. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't trust. But it was something softer than disbelief. A quiet understanding, perhaps, that the world was not as divided into hatred as she had once believed. One of the younger prisoners lowered her gaze to her plate, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. She had joined the war believing she understood everything, right and wrong, friend and enemy, punishment and reward. But now, as she sat in a warm hall eating a meal she never expected, she realized how much she didn't understand at all. Another woman broke a piece of bread in half and stared at it. She whispered a single word. Mercy. She didn't say it to anyone in particular, but the sound reached those nearest to her, and they looked at her with something like agreement. Not because the word felt easy, but because it felt true. Mercy did not erase the war. It did not erase guilt, loss, or devastation, but it carved out a moment where humanity reclaimed its space amid ruin. As the women continued eating, something remarkable happened. Conversations began to emerge. Quiet ones at first, soft exchanges. A question here, a murmured memory there. It wasn't joy, they were not ready for that. But it was connection. Shared astonishment, shared relief, shared understanding that this night was something they would never forget. The shadows from the lanterns danced gently across the walls, creating a warm, golden glow that softened everything it touched. The guards, now relaxed, stood like silent guardians of an unexpected peace. The women, still weary but no longer frozen in fear, allowed themselves to experience the moment fully. Every bite they took reminded them that despite everything, despite the war, despite the loss, despite the uncertainty, they were still human. Their captors understood that. And in this quiet hall, around this long table, that truth mattered more than anything else. The realization settled over them with a slow, powerful weight. Survival did not always arrive through strength. Sometimes it arrived through mercy. Sometimes, through a warm meal shared in silence. Sometimes, through the unexpected kindness of those they once saw as enemies. And this night would remain carved into their memories as the moment their world shifted. Not through force, but through humanity.